And before this video begins, I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. Every now and then I'll come across a movie that leaves me a little bit confused and scratching my head. Probably explains my hairline, to be honest. Today, thanks to my loyal Patreon supporter Glenna Clark, I'm here to talk about one of these bizarre, mind-bending movies. This is Undergods, the 2020 feature film debut of music video director Chino Moya, known for videos for years and years, Marina and the Diamonds, St. Vincent, and a number of adverts. Undergods throws you into a complex world of decline and muted conformity as we follow three different yet slightly connected stories of the passive, stagnating lives of those within its dystopian, timeless nightmare. It's a film that promises a lot, offering you a front row ticket to a future alien and terrifying to us all, yet one that could be right around the corner at any given moment. It even boasts a solid multinational European cast, including names like Kate Dickie, Ned Dennehy, Tanya Reynolds, and Michael Gould. So there's a lot of talent there. But going from short music videos and adverts to a full 90-minute movie is a pretty big jump. So does Undergods deliver on its bleak, poignant promises of a chilling parable of our future? Or is it a disappointing big screen debut that's all style but no substance? Well, as always, that's what I'm here to find out. So join me today for a deep dive into the world of Undergods. The first thing you notice about Undergods is the bleak, fog-shrouded atmosphere as we descend into this world of despair and suffering. The streets are lined with the dead or dying, and the whole look and feel of the movie is filled with this sense of decay and emptiness. I really love this visual direction and the cinematic despair of Undergods. Everything is just so grey and muted. It's beautiful in a very ugly way. This whole look reminding you of the distant memory of colour and joy. I find it so entrancing in that aspect, it's quite haunting in a way. The narrative framing segments are all so colourless, but even when we do zoom in on the specific stories, the colour is still in the process of fading away, hinting at that societal downfall. One thing I especially love is how the movie was filmed in the Serbian capital Belgrade, using CGI and visual effects to create such a dead world, with these bombed out streets and buildings looking like something from a post-apocalyptic wasteland. It helps make Undergods feel more expansive, but without ever taking away from the depressing isolation of the movie. I think the effects team did such an amazing job with the visuals here, and it really lends so much to the movie, especially how it contrasts with those individual stories, which may still be bleak and fading, but there's at least some sign of life, compared to this dead world with no hope or life remaining. Moya was inspired by the brutalist architecture of Eastern Europe, marrying this look and feel with his fascination for totalitarian and both fascist and communist regimes. Indeed, the director was born just months after General Franco passed away, signalling the end of Spain's nationalist dictatorship, which had been established all the way back in 1936 during the Spanish Civil War. This means Moya was born during the in-between time before democracy, and this sense of limbo is clear within Undergods, with everything and everyone just kind of drifting along and trying to survive however they can. I mean, just look at the characters K and Z, who traverse this wasteland and collect the dead and dying for meat or for slavery, because that's the only way they can keep themselves alive, along with drinking petrol, you know. Yummy. Much like the physical colours of the movie, the humanity within Undergods is faded, with morality a relic of better days. The whole film is about people destroying each other in some form or another, everyone's selfish and living for themselves. It's a commentary on society and the need for community. The spectre of totalitarianism looms above us all. It's all too easy to end up with a society like that, and we're not immune to the quick descent and undoing of democracy and community. As Moya himself explains, totalitarianism and social decay is always right around the corner, like suddenly opening a door into hell. And we definitely see that in Undergods, even literally at one point. Moya had wanted to make a film for a long time, but he couldn't settle on one singular idea or world to explore, so he ended up using multiple, creating this anthology film inspired by things like The Twilight Zone and The Tales of Hoffman, which makes a symbolic appearance within the film itself. The first story is framed as a dream Kay has of Ron, a man in a loveless marriage to Ruth within a modest flat, the only occupied one in the entire building. However, then the charismatic Harry knocks on the door, claiming to live on the 11th floor of the building, but being locked out of his flat. Out of a sense of neighbourly morality, they let Harry in to use their phone, only for him to end up staying overnight, then all weekend, quickly forcing himself into the lives of this couple and upturning their routines and sense of safety, with a blatant disregard for Ron's boundaries and comfort, even sleeping with Ruth just because he can. Eventually, it turns out that there aren't actually any finished flats on the 11th floor, so Harry's entire story was a lie, resulting in Ron kicking him out and attempting to kill him, only for Ron to end up dead in an ambiguous ending, raising the question of whether Harry was even real to begin with. It's a decent start to the movie, a very self-contained story with a basic premise, but it does have some very interesting themes baked within it. Much like every other story in Undergods, this opening narrative is about a home being intruded upon by a stranger, who disrupts the status quo, resulting in this kind of deception and death. Ron and Ruth are very settled and complacent. Their relationship is already in decay, but it's made so much worse by the charismatic and confident Harry, who is almost like the polar opposite of Ron, which is why he finds it so easy to seduce Ruth. It's a very common story type, the home-wrecking stranger who swaggers in and claims everything for themselves because they simply can. Ron essentially has no backbone. He allows this man to walk all over him because he can't or won't fight back. Even when he does, telling Harry to leave, he's quickly manipulated back into passive submission. Both men are viewed as immoral characters in different ways. Harry is a manipulative, intrusive figure who only cares about invading the space and hijacking the couple's resources and security. But Ron is a selfish, uncaring man who takes his wife for granted and refuses to engage with her, more interested in watching the TV. Ron only seems to care about Ruth when he realizes she's being taken away from him, showing a desire for control rather than connection. Obviously, Ron is right to be distrustful of Harry, and it is somewhat sympathetic to see him losing his way of life to this other man, but the story doesn't make him a tragic hero, something made very clear as he shouts at and abuses Ruth. He makes it too easy for her to be disloyal with their stale relationship, sleeping in separate beds, and even Ron's dreams or flashbacks of Ruth belittling him and outright wishing he was dead. In every interaction in this segment of the film, Ron is like a passenger. He has no control over everything, and that eats away at him endlessly. It's as if this story is his karma for being so complacent and passive all his life. Even when he sees his wife in bed with another man, he simply sighs and walks away. The reaction of a downtrodden, meek man with no agency or self-respect. Harry and Ron are both selfish, but in different ways. They only care about themselves, but where Harry pursues what he wants, Ron just sits by and expects things to work out. It's a parable against passiveness, a reminder to stand up for your own values and avoid allowing yourself to be brushed aside, but also to avoid pursuing invasive totalitarian control over others. Chino Moya wanted viewers to see that they shouldn't end up like the people of Undergods, to reconsider their lives, and I think that's clear in this opening salvo, imploring you to be none of these three characters because they're all horrible people. Much like the first story, the second is a parable-like story as old as time. Introduced as a bedtime story told by Octavius to his daughter, the second narrative is a tale of Hans, a rich and powerful businessman who meets with the foreigner, an eccentric inventor whose blueprints are perfect for Hans. However, ever the businessman, Hans steals the plans for himself to avoid having to pay the foreigner what he's owed for these revolutionary yet ambiguous blueprints. But like every parable ever, Hans pays a grave price for this, with his beloved, spirited daughter Maria going missing soon after, with the foreigner the most obvious culprit. Hans enlists Maria's drunken, free-thinking, pretentious boyfriend Johann to help him track her down to a creepy abandoned building, only for the pair to stumble out into the wastelands of the framing narrative, somehow. Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. And then they both die. Again, I'll get to that bit. This story is a bit weird in that nothing really happens, and it's pretty boring, with even Octavius' daughter calling it out. The obvious moral of the story is to not steal other people's ideas, which goes without saying, but there are actually a lot of other narrative threads woven throughout the story. The second story is interesting because it's very much a story about capitalism and idealism. You have characters like Hans, who is this ruthless businessman who can only think about maximizing profits and exploiting others. However, his daughter Maria is the one singular person person he cares about, like a ray of sunshine in this grey and soulless world, because she has yet to become jaded like the other characters of the movie. In a world full of these beaten down, old and ugly people, Maria is basically the only conventionally attractive character, further showing that idealism she represents. And there's obviously a level of hypocrisy there, because her idealism and more progressive values are built off the back of capitalism and exploitation, without her complaining about being part of that system because it makes her life better. She's almost like a champagne socialist in that regard, dating the unkempt and drunken Johann as a way of lightly protesting against the system she doesn't actually want to lose, which does happen as the foreigner kidnaps her and takes her out of her comfortable capitalist world and forces her out into the real world of life and fear. Despite the film being very critical of the male identity, it doesn't give the women of Undergods a free pass, showing that they themselves are heavily flawed and just as destructive. However, neither Hans nor Maria seem to face any real proper consequences for their actions, worldview, or behaviour. We never actually see what happens to Maria, and Hans is just randomly beaten to death, which doesn't feel like a symbolic or poetic ending for this character. Yeah, so a big problem with Undergods is how it just doesn't resolve things because of how its anthologies transition into one another. By his own admission, Moya didn't want Undergods to be a traditional anthology film. He didn't want it to be a collection of shorts with clear endings. Instead, he took inspiration from Ovid's Metamorphoses, which has 150 stories often transforming into one another and flowing throughout, which is clearly what is attempted with transitions like Hans and Johann accidentally arriving in the wasteland, with Johann being taken into slavery and dying, allowing the film to then pick up the story of one of his fellow slaves being freed. It's a nice idea on paper, having these stories that don't quite finish as we expected, but I don't think it works in practice. It doesn't feel like an intentional flow through different worlds. Things just feel disconnected and unsatisfying in an incoherent way. We get all these beautiful visuals and a lot of style, but the stories themselves lack a lot of substance and feel very bland and a bit pointless, honestly. None of them really have a satisfying end, but it doesn't feel thematic or poignant that these narratives stop so suddenly. Instead, it just feels like a waste of time. Moya wanted to leave the reality of these stories up to interpretation, because you have stories within dreams, but then the supposed reality appearing within said stories and said dreams. It's all very complicated and makes you question reality itself, but it again doesn't feel like it's being done for the right reasons. Moya claimed in an interview that he wanted the audience to get lost following the story, so people would just let it go and go with the flow. But to me personally, that comes across as bad filmmaking, because you want the audience to just hand wave away all the flaws and just go along with those vibes, which doesn't make for a satisfying viewing experience. Indeed, the whole movie wasn't really planned out, it was just an urge to make a film after failed attempts. The entire film came straight out of Moya's brain like a stream of consciousness, and again, that's not exactly good filmmaking in my opinion. There's no sense of cohesion or tightness, and the lack of cohesion isn't used as a purposeful piece of commentary. It just ends up making the whole movie empty and boring, taking such a long time to barely even say anything at all. If the very writer of the movie admits he didn't have a plan, then how can the movie be trusted to deliver any real intentional commentary? I mean, it does, of course, but it still raises the question of how much of it was intentionally written well and how much of it was simply a happy accident. Anyway, to get back on track, the third and final story is all about the former slave Sam winning a lottery and earning his freedom, returning home to find his wife Rachel having remarried to Dominic. Dominic is actually the point of view character in this segment, working in a chewing gum factory owned by Bern Gorman of Torchwood fame. He's just kind of there, the film barely uses him. Anyway, Dominic is very good at his job, but his life begins to fracture and crumble when Sam appears and disrupts the status quo, with Rachel dedicating her time to try and rehabilitate Sam, allowing her marriage with Dominic to fade away as she almost drops him entirely and pretends he doesn't exist. As Dominic's life continues to lose all meaning, he attends a party thrown by his boss, trying and failing to flirt with the women there and getting drunker and drunker until he eventually makes a fool of himself during a group karaoke of My Way. He gets thrown out, somehow makes it home without crashing his car, only to lose his temper at Rachel and vent his frustrations. And then Sam utters his first words all story.
You talk too much.
You talk too much. Never shut up. I said you talk too much. Oh boy, you never shut up.
Having managed to regain his ability to speak, Sam just kills both Dominic and Rachel out of nowhere before sitting down to watch birds flying around. That's it. That's Undergods. See what I mean about unsatisfying endings? Because that's the end of the entire movie. Dominic is an interesting character that brings to life a lot of the themes within the wider movie. He's a very dislikable figure, but he's the closest thing to a somewhat decent person from the old world. All sense of morality and civility is gone from the world, and every character is out for themselves in a very selfish way, only caring about what they want. But Dominic at least tries, like when he buys Rachel a kettle for her birthday. However, I think the script gets a bit muddled when it comes to Dominic. When writing it, Moya hated Dominic the most as a human being, suggesting he too is meant to be a very selfish and immoral character. But the performance of the character actually makes him a lot more sympathetic because of his vulnerability and emotional fragility, which kind of suggests bad writing to me, because that apparent intent to make him a bad person seems to have been lost in translation, because instead you just kind of feel bad for him. His whole life gets turned inside out and thrown upside down. His wife leaves him, his stepson hates him, this is all just a nightmare. So you can't help but sympathize with him, especially when Rachel just immediately drops him because she never actually loved him and now thinks things can just immediately go back to normal now that Sam is back in her life. I mean, Dominic is at least shown to be a bit rational, whereas Rachel loses herself in pseudoscience and becomes quite a spiteful and villainous character. It's all quite messy and not necessarily in a good way. Much like Ron in the first story, Dominic is a character who just kind of sleepwalks his way through life, moving through this world as a small man with no backbone. He hates that Sam is encroaching in on his life, taking things like his chair, but Dominic fears Sam because of his insecure masculinity. Dominic is this small, weak, balding middle manager, compared to Sam, who is taller, stronger, and more manly. So Dominic doesn't stand up to him or attempt to stamp his authority on the situation because of how small and weak he is in comparison, therefore allowing all of this to happen to him, much like Ron did. That My Way karaoke scene, as intentionally cringe and comical as it is, actually exposes a lot of this fragile masculinity, because it's a symbolic moment of Dominic trying to take back his authority and control in the face of the humiliation of his family comfort disintegrating. His wife hates him, his son hates him, and he's realized his boss doesn't actually care about him like he thought. So it's this big emotional release for Dominic as he almost tries to convince himself he's still in control. My Way is a song all about living life on your own terms, and the most symbolic moment comes in that climactic chorus with the words, "For what is a man, what has he got? If not himself, then he has naught. To say the things he truly feels and not the words of one who kneels." You have to be your own person, you have to stay true to yourself, which characters like Dominic and Ron never do, because they allow themselves to be used by others, they're never truly free. And the sad irony of it is, when these characters do finally decide to take action for themselves, they die for it. Dominic gets thrown out of the party for being a drunken lout and then gets his head caved in by Sam. So it all comes to nothing, and it's actually Sam, the intruder, who gets to break free and gets to do it his way by ridding himself of these two incredibly negative influences in his life. Moya wanted people to make whatever they wanted out of Undergods, but his main intention was to comment on society, how they're made based on ideas, but never really work out when you put them into practice. There is no true utopia, and a big part of that is the lack of community and morality ingrained within human nature. He wanted us to think about the times we're living in and the way we're treating each other. We, like the characters within the film, behave out of selfishness and greed. We don't help each other or embrace that feeling of community. There's a real feeling of spiritual decay and a lack of individuality, like we see as these characters grapple with who they actually are and, in Moya's own words, essentially end up paying for their sins. Each story sees these middle-class families imploding because of a crisis of confidence within the patriarchal figure as they try to tread the line between dominance and submission. There's even the theme of sexual jealousy. Even Hans seems potentially jealous of Johann sleeping with Maria, despite Hans obviously being her dad. All these characters seek control and resent anyone that threatens that, regardless of who is in the moral right in each situation. Without community and common existence, we struggle with who we are and who we want to be, especially with a lack of control leading us to make questionable moral decisions because everyone is out for themselves in an increasingly regressive and selfish society. However, again, this element of the film being a collection of moral tales wasn't really a deliberate choice by Moya, as he himself admits. It just kind of ended up that way as he wrote. So it continues to make you wonder just how much of this film was genuinely, purposefully thought-provoking and how much of it was simply accidental. I don't think I like Undergods. Don't get me wrong, it looks absolutely gorgeous, but that's only part of the equation when it comes to making a movie or even a TV show. It's understandable that the visuals of the movie are its highlight, given Moya's music video background, but it also makes it painfully clear that he's not used to actually writing narratives. The anthology idea is nice, and having them morph into one another is a unique concept, but it doesn't make for satisfying viewing because the stories themselves are pretty bland, derivative, and having them end so abruptly feels like a waste of time. It just doesn't seem to go anywhere. And yes, it's clear that the surreal, strange world of Undergods is designed to be more thematic, but even then, a lot of those themes feel quite shallow. The political criticisms are interesting, sure, but it doesn't offer anything new in that regard. Really, the most notable themes are those of fragile masculinity and morality, with the latter not even an intentional theme. The masculinity approach is great within the film, but it doesn't seem to know what the message really is. Characters like Ron and Dominic are criticised for being too weak, but then the film punishes them for trying to take control, so there's no clear idea as to what they were meant to do all along, if anything at all. And that's my main issue with Undergods. Underneath the beautiful visuals, grip and direction, and excellent acting, what actually is there to be learned? It starts off strong, but quickly loses steam, and you wonder where it's even going. And of course, it doesn't go anywhere at all. It ends up feeling like it uses ambiguity and surrealness as a shield to excuse poor writing, because if anyone calls it out, you can just say, well, it's not meant to make sense. I was really excited going into Undergods. I thought it was going to be great, but I ended up so disappointed at what turned out to be a huge waste of potential, and the whole thing is superfluous. Like I mentioned earlier, it takes a lot of time to really not say anything at all. So yeah, that's what I thought of Undergods. I don't think I'd recommend checking it out for yourself, but that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you again to Glenn O'Clock for commissioning this review. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give an extra special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Platinum level patron Matthew Burns, and all my Gold level patrons Chris Douglas, Daniel Shillito, Thomas Czar, and the 3 Railway Engines. Thank you so much for your support.